Everyone, how are we? Hello, hello, hello. Oh, how it's so nice to see everyone again. I apologize if I am coughing a lot or if I'm sounding a bit off. I kind of, I got a little sick, trying to recover as best as I can. So there's gonna be a lot of water sipping. Like right now, everyone make sure you take your beginning water sips. Hope everyone's been having a good day. We are gonna be continuing our read through of Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. I do want to preface by saying that because this is a more relaxing stream, this is a more calm stream, that we don't, really use any of the sound alerts. I don't want to restrict it from you. I don't want to take them away, but I think we can, understand that now is not the time for that. Something like tomorrow's streams would be, but today is not, okay? So I just wanted to preface that. Hello, 7-star. Hello, Leviathan. Hello, Miss Shuri. OMG, I'm so excited for this one. I stayed up. I'm so glad. I mean, I hope you sleep well, but I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad to see you here. Yeah, I did get a wee bit sick, and so my throat's a bit rough around the edges. But, it's okay. It's okay. I'm not losing my voice or anything, so it's fine. That's what matters, is that I don't lose my voice. And then I might as well have a little intermission of eating food, as I did just get out of class, so I'm a bit hungry, and if you hear me slurping on noodles, that's why. But it's more of an issue if you don't like the noodle slurping ASMR. Okay, there we go. Hello, Harlequin. I'm glad to see that you're excited. I'm so glad. I sometimes wonder if I'm the only one who enjoys reading books. But I'm glad that you guys are excited to listen to me, you know? It's nice. Sick as well. Sending love and hugs back to you, Miss Shuri. I hope you get well soon. Alright, so finding our place of where we left off, we are just before chapter 6, the Old Forest. For those of you who may or may not remember, we have well, Frodo has found out that the whole jig of him, you know, going to this new house that he's gonna stay in, that he's gonna be leaving everyone, wasn't necessarily all that much of a secret. Sam, Merry, and Pippin kind of already know that that's what's kind of going on, and they're like, hey, you know, we're your friends, we're your besties, we are like family, we are going to stick with you no matter what, all right? And Frodo was like, I mean, you know, this makes it all the less anxious for himself because it's such like a daunting journey to make on his own. So he still has the ring, no sign of Gandalf, and so the big thing that they were debating is whether or not they should stay a little bit, maybe a day or so, to wait for Gandalf, see if he comes around, or if they should leave as soon as possible. And the way that they are going to be leaving without being noticed is through the forest. So that is where we left off, and that's why we are going to pick up with the chapter called The Old Forest. I meant to say that I've noticed a lot of people are getting sick. Yeah, it's not only just around that time in the year, but it's also, you know, if one person gets sick, 3 people are gonna get sick, then 5, and it spreads like that. But for whoever may be feeling under the weather, for anyone who is recovering from being sick, I hope that this kind of eases you, puts your mind to rest, because I know it can be really hard to sleep well and to recover peacefully when you are, you know, feeling just awful. So I really hope that this helps you, okay? I'll take one more water sip before we start. Okay, there we go. All right, chapter 6, The Old Forest. Frodo woke suddenly. It was still dark in the room. Merry was standing there with a candle in one hand and banging on the door with the other. All right, what is it? Said Frodo, still shaken and bewildered. What is it? Cried Merry. It's time to get up. It's 4:30 and very foggy. Come on. Sam is already getting breakfast ready. Even Pippin is up. I'm just going to saddle the ponies and fetch the one that is to be the baggage carrier. Wake that sluggard Fatty. At least he must get up and see us off. Soon after 6 o'clock, the 5 hobbits were ready to start. Fatty Bulger was still yawning. They stole quietly out of the house. Merry went in front, leading a laden pony, and took his way along a path that went through a spinney behind the house, and then cut across several fields. The leaves of trees were glistening, and every twig was dripping. The grass was gray with cold dew. Everything was still, and faraway noises seemed near and clear. Fowls chattering in a yard, someone closing a door of a distant house. In their shed, they found the ponies, sturdy little beasts of a kind loved by hobbits. Not speedy, but good for a long day's work. They mounted, and soon they were riding off into the mist, which seemed open reluctantly before them and close forbiddingly behind them. After riding for about an hour, slowly, without talking, they saw the hedge looming suddenly ahead. It was tall and netted over with silver cobwebs. How are you going to get through this? Asked Fredgar. Follow me, said Merry, and you will see. He turned to the left along the hedge, and soon they came to a point where it bent inwards, running along the lip of a hollow. A cutting had been made at some distance from the hedge, and went sloping gently down into the ground. It had walls of brick at the sides, which rose steadily, until suddenly they arched over and formed a tunnel that dived deep under the hedge and came out in the hollow on the other side. Here, Fatty Bulger halted. "Goodbye, Frodo," he said. "I wish you were not going into the forest. I only hope you would not need rescuing before the day is out. But good luck to you, today and every day." "If there are no worse things ahead than the old forest, I shall be lucky," said Frodo. "Tell Gandalf to hurry along the east road. We shall be soon back on it, and going as fast as we can." "Goodbye," they cried, and rode down the slope and disappeared from Fredger's sight into the tunnel. It was dark and damp. At the far end, it was closed by a gate of thick-set iron bars. Merry got down and unlocked the gate, and when they all had passed through, he pushed to it again. It shut with a clang, and the lock clicked. The sound was ominous. "There," said Merry. "You have left the Shire, and are now outside and on the edge of the old forest." "Are the stories about it true?" asked Pippin. "I don't know what stories you mean," Merry answered. "If you mean the old bogey stories Fatty's nurses used to tell him about goblins and wolves and things of that sort, I should say no. At any rate, I don't believe them. But the forest is queer. Everything in it is very much more alive, more aware of what's going on, so to speak, than the Shire than things are in the Shire. And the trees do not like strangers. They watch you. They are usually content merely to watch you as long as the daylight lasts, and don't do much. Occasionally, the most unfriendly ones may drop a branch, or stick a root out, or grasp you with a long trailer, but at night, things can be more alarming, or so I am told. I have only once or twice been here after dark, and then only near the hedge. I thought all the trees were whispering to each other, passing news and plots along in an unintelligible language, and the branches swayed and groped without any wind. They do say the trees do actually move, and can surround strangers and hem them in. In fact, long ago, they attacked the hedge. They came and planted themselves right by it, and leaned over it. But the hobbits came and cut down hundreds of trees, and made a great bonfire in the forest, and burned all the ground at a long strip east of the hedge. After that, the trees gave up the attack, but they became very unfriendly. There was still a wide, bare space not far inside where the bonfire was made. "Is it only the trees that are dangerous?" asked Pippin. "There are various queer things living deep in the forest, and on the far side," said Merry. "Or at least, I have heard so, but I have never seen any of them. But something makes paths. Whenever one comes inside, finds open tracks, but they seem to shift and to change from time to time in a queer fashion. Not far from the tunnel there is, or was for a long time, the beginning of quite a broad path leading to the bonfire glade. And then, on more or less in our direction, east and a little north. That is a path I am going to try and find." The hobbits now left the tunnel gate and rode across the wide hollow. On the far side, there was a faint path leading onto the floor of the forest, 100 yards and more beyond the hedge, but it vanished as soon as it brought them under the trees. Looking back, they could see the dark outline of the hedge through the stems of trees that were already thick about them. Looking ahead, they could see only tree trunks of innumerable sizes and shapes, straight or bent, twisted, leaning, squat or slender, smooth or gnarled and branched. And all the stems were green or gray with moss and slimy, shaggy growths. Merry alone seemed fairly cheerful. "You had better lead on and find that path," said Frodo to him. "Don't let us lose one another or forget which way the hedge lies." They picked a way among the trees, and their ponies plodded along, carefully avoiding the many writhing and interlacing roots. There was no undergrowth. The ground was rising steadily, and as they went forward, it seemed that the trees became taller, darker, and thicker. There was no sound except for an occasional drip of moisture falling through the still leaves. For a moment, there was no whispering or movement among the branches, but they all got an uncomfortable feeling that they were being watched with disapproval, deepening to dislike and even enmity. The feeling steadily grew until they found themselves looking up quickly or glancing back over their shoulders, as if they expected a sudden blow. There was not as yet any sign of a path, and the trees seemed constantly to bar their way. Pippin suddenly felt that he could not bear it any longer, and without warning let out a shout. "Oi, oi," he cried. "I am not going to do anything. Just let me pass through, will you?" The others halted, startled, but the cry fell as if muffled by a heavy curtain. There was no echo or answer, though the wood seemed to become more crowded and more watchful than before. "I should not shout if I were you," said Mary. "It does more harm than good." Rhoda began to wonder if it were possible to find a way through, and if he had been right to make the others come into this abominable wood. Mary was looking from side to side and seemed already uncertain which way to go. Pippin noticed it. "It had not taken you long to lose us," he said, but at that moment Mary gave a whistle of relief and pointed ahead. "Well, well," he said, "these trees do shift. There is the bonfire glade in front of us, or I hope so, but the path to it seems to have moved away." The light grew clearer as they went forward. Suddenly, they came out of the trees and found themselves in a wide circular space. There was a sky above them, blue and clear to their surprise, for down under the forest roof they had not been able to see the rising morning and the lifting of mist. The sun was not, however, high enough to yet shine down the clearing, though its light is on the treetops. The leaves were all thicker and greener about the edges of the glade, enclosing it with an almost solid wall. No tree grew there, only rough grass and many tall plants, stocky and faded hemlocks and wood parsley, fireweed seeding into fluffy ashes, and rampant nettles and thistles. A dreary place, but it seemed a charming and cheerful garden after the closed forest. The hobbits felt encouraged, and they looked up hopefully at the broadening daylight in the sky. At the far side of the glade, there was a break in the wall of trees, and a clear path beyond it. They could see it running onto the wood, wide in places and open above, though every now and again the trees drew in and overshadowed it with their dark boughs. Up this path they rode. They were still climbing gently, but now they went much quicker, and with better heart, for it seemed to them that the forest had relented and was going to let them pass unhindered after all. But after a while, the air began to get hot and stuffy. The trees drew close again on either side, and they could no longer see far ahead. Now, stronger than ever, they felt again the ill will of the wood pressing on them. So silently was it that the fall of their ponies' hooves, rustling on dead leaves and occasionally stumbling on hidden roots, seemed to thud in their ears. Frodo tried to sing a song to encourage them, but his voice sank into a murmur. "O wanderers in the shadowed land, despair not, for though dark they stand, all woods there must be an end at last. And see the open sun go past, the setting sun, the rising sun, the day's end, or the day begun. For east or west all woods must fail." Fail. Even as he said the word, his voice faded into silence. The air seemed heavy and making of the words worrisome. Just behind them, a large branch fell from an overhanging tree with a crash into the path. The trees seemed to close in before them. "They do not like all of that about ending and failing," said Mary. "I should not sing any more at present. Wait till we get to the edge. Then we'll turn and give them a rousing chorus." He spoke cheerfully, and if he felt any great anxiety, it did not show it. The others did not answer. They were depressed. A heavy weight was settling steadily on Frodo's heart, and he regretted now with every step forward that he had ever thought of challenging the menace of the trees. He was, indeed, just about to stop and propose going back, if that was still possible, when things took a new turn. The path stopped climbing and became for a while nearly level. The dark trees grew aside and ahead before they could see the path going almost straight forward. Before them, but some distance off, there stood a green hilltop, treeless, rising like a bald head out of an encircling wood. The path seemed to be making directly for it. They now hurried forward again, delighted with the thought of climbing out for a while above the roof of the forest. The path dipped and then again began to climb upwards, leading them at last to the foot of the steep hillside. There it left the trees and faded into the turf. The woods still all around the hill like thick hair that ended sharply in a circle around a shaven crown. The hobbits led their ponies up, winding round and round until they reached the top. There they stood and gazed about them. The air was gleaming and sunlit, but hazy, and they could not see to any great distance. Near at hand, the mist was now almost gone, though here and there it lays in hollows of the wood, and to the south of them, out of a deep fold cutting across the forest, the fog still rose like steam or wisps of white smoke. "That," said Mary, pointing with his hand, "that is the line of the Withywindle. It comes down of the downs and flows the southwest through the midst of the forest to join the Brandywine below Haysend. We don't want to go that way. The Withywindle Valley is said to be the queerest part of the whole wood, the center from which all the queerness comes, as it were." The others looked in the direction that Mary pointed out, but they could see little but mists over the damp and deep-cut valley, and beyond it, the southern half of the forest faded from view. The sun on the hilltop was now getting hot. It must have been about 11 o'clock, but the autumn haze still prevented them from seeing much in the other directions. It was the west that they could not make out either the line of the hedge or the valley of Brandywine beyond it. Northward, where they looked most hopefully, they could see nothing that might be the line of the great east road for which they were making. They were on an island in a sea of trees, and the horizon was veiled. On the southeastern side of the ground fell steeply, as if the slopes of the hill continued far down under the trees, like island shores that really are the sides of the mountain rising out of deep waters. They sat on the green edge and looked out over the woods below them. While they ate their midday meal, as the sun rose and past noon, they glimpsed far off in the east gray-green lines of the downs that lay beyond the old forest on that side. That cheered them greatly, for it was good to see a sight of anything beyond the wood's borders, though they did not mean to go that way, if they could help it. The Barrow Downs had as sinister a reputation in Hobbit legend as the forest itself. At length they made up their minds to go on again. The path that had brought them down the hill reappeared on the northward side, but they had not followed it far before they became aware that it was bending steadily to the right. Soon it began to descend rapidly, and they guessed that it might actually be heading northwards, up towards the Withywind Valley. Not at all the direction they wished to take. After some discussion, they decided to leave this misleading path and strike northward, for although they had not been able to see it from the hilltop, the road must lie that way, and if it could not be many miles off. Also northward, and to the left of the path, the land seemed to be drier and more open, climbing up slopes where the trees were thinner, and pines and firs replaced the oaks and ashes of other strange and nameless trees of the denser wood. At first, their choice seemed to be good. They got along at a fair speed, and though whenever they got a glimpse of the sun in an open glade, they seemed unaccountably to have veered eastwards. But after a time, the trees began to close in again, just where they had appeared from a distance, to be thinner and less tangled. Then deep folds in the ground were discovered unexpectedly, like the ruts of great giant wheels, or wide moats and sunken roads, long disused and choked with brambles. These lay usually right across their line of march, and could only be crossed by scrambling down and out again, which was troublesome and difficult with their ponies. Each time they climbed down, they found hollow filled with thick bushes and matted undergrowth, which somehow would not yield to the left, but only gave way when they turned to the right. And they had to go some distance along the bottom before they could find a way up the further bank. Each time they clambered out, the trees seemed deeper and darker. The trees seemed deeper and darker, and always to the left and upwards. It was most difficult to find a way, and they were forced to the right and downwards. I did say this is not the time for sound alerts. I will ask once again to not redeem the sound alerts, or I will take them away. After an hour or so, they had lost all clear sense of direction, though they all knew well enough that they had long ceased to go northward at all. They were being headed off, and were simply following a course chosen for them, eastwards and southwards, into the heart of the forest, and not out of it. The afternoon was weary away, and they scrambled and stumbled into a fold that was wider and deeper than any they had yet met. It was so steep and overhung that it proved impossible to climb out of it again, either forwards or backwards, without leaving their ponies and their baggage behind. All they could do was follow the fold downwards. The ground grew soft in places boggy. Springs appeared in banks, and soon they found themselves following a brook that trickled and babbled through a weedy bed. Then the ground began to fall rapidly, and the brook, growing strong and noisy, flowed and leaped swiftly downhill. They were in a deep, dim-lit gully, overarched by trees high above them. After stumbling along for some way along the stream, they came quite suddenly out of the gloom. As if through a gate, they saw sunlight before them. Coming to the opening, they found that they had made their way through a cleft in a high, steep bank, almost a cliff, as its feet was a wide space of grass and reeds. In the distance could be glimpsed another bank, almost as steep. A golden afternoon of late sunshine lay warm and drowsy upon the hidden land between. In the midst of I lost my place. In the midst of it, there wound lazily a dark river of brown water, bordered with ancient willows, arched over with willows, blocked with fallen willows, and feckled with thousands of faded willow leaves. The air was thick with them, fluttering yellow from the branches, for there was a warm and gentle breeze blowing softly in the valley, and the reeds were rustling, and the willow boughs were creaking. "Well, now I have at least some notion of where we are," said Mary. "We have come almost in the opposite direction to which we intended. This is the river Withywindle, and I will go on and explore." He passed out into the sunshine and disappeared into the long grass. After a while he reappeared and reported there was fairly solid ground between the cliff foot and the river. In some places, firm turf went down into the water's edge. "What's more," he said, "there seems to be something like a footpath winding along this side of the river. If we turn left and follow it, we shall be bound to come out on the east side of the forest eventually." "Dare I say," said Pippin, "that is, if the track goes on so far, and does not simply lead us into a bog and leave us there. Who made the track, do you suppose, and why? I am sure it was not for our benefit. I am getting very suspicious of this forest and everything in it, and I begin to believe all the stories about it. And have you any idea how far eastward we should have to go?" "No," said Mary, "I haven't. I don't know in the least how far down the Withywindle we are, or who could possibly come here often enough to make a path along it. But there is no other way out that I can think or see of." There being nothing else for it, they filed out, and Mary led them to the path that they had discovered. Everywhere the reeds and grasses were lush and tall, in places far above their heads. But once found, the path was easy to follow, as it turned and twisted, picking out the sounder ground among the bogs and pools. Here and there it passed over the other rills, running down gullies into the Withywindle, out of the higher forest lands, and at these points there were tree trunks or bundles of brushwood laid carefully across. The hobbits began to feel very hot. There were armies of flies of all kind buzzing around their ears, and the afternoon sun was burning on their backs. At last they came suddenly to a thin shade. Great gray branches reached across the path. Each step forward became more reluctant than the last. Sleepiness seemed to be creeping out from the ground and up their legs, and falling softly out of the air upon their head and eyes. Frodo felt his chin go down and his head nod. Just in front of him, Pippin fell forward onto his knees. Frodo halted. "It's no good," he heard Merry saying. "Can't go another step without rest. Must have a nap. It's cool under the willows, less flies." Frodo did not like the sound of this. "Come on," he cried, "but we can't have a nap yet. We must get clear of the forest first." But the others were too far gone to care. Beside them, Sam stood, yawning and blinking stupidly. Suddenly, Frodo himself felt sleep overwhelming him. His head swam. There now seemingly hardly a sound in the air. The flies had stopped buzzing. Only a gentle noise on the edge of hearing. A soft fluttering, as if a song half-whispered, seemed to stir in the boughs above. He lifted his heavy eyes and saw leaning over him a huge willow tree, old and hoary. Enormous it looked, its sprawling branches going up like reaching arms with many long-fingered hands. Its knotted and twisted trunk gaping in wide fissures that creaked faintly as the boughs moved. The leaves fluttering against the bright sky dazzled him, and he toppled over, lying where he fell upon the grass. Merry and Pippin dragged themselves forward and lay down with their backs to the willow trunk. Beside them, the great cracks gaped wide to receive them as the tree swayed and creaked. They looked up at the gray-yellow leaves and moving softly against the light and singing. They shut their eyes and then it seemed that they could almost hear words, cool words, saying something about water and sleep. They gave themselves up to the spell and fell fast asleep at the foot of the gray, great willow. Frodo lay for a while fighting with the sleep that was overpowering him, and then with an effort, he struggled to his feet again. He felt a compelling desire for cool water. "Wait for me, Sam," he stammered. "Must bathe feet a minute." Half in a dream, he wandered forward to the riverside of the tree, where great winding roots grew into its stream, like gnarled dragonets straining down to drink. He straddled one of these and paddled his hot feet into the cool brown water, and there he too suddenly fell asleep, with his back against the tree. Sam sat down and scratched his head, and yawned like a cavern. He was worried. The afternoon was getting late, and he thought this sudden sleepiness uncanny. "There's more behind this than the sun and warm air," he muttered to himself. "I don't like this great, big tree. I don't trust it. Hark at it singing about sleep now. This won't do at all." He pulled himself to his feet and staggered off to see what had become of the ponies. He found that two had wandered on a good way along the path, and he had just caught them and brought them back towards the others, when he heard two noises, one loud, and the other soft, but very clear. One was the splash of something very heavy falling into the water. The other was a noise like the snick of a lock when a door quietly closes fast. He rushed to the back of the bank. Frodo was in the water close to the edge, and a great tree root seemed to be over him and holding him down. But he was not struggling. Sam gripped him by the jacket and dragged him from under the root, and then with difficulty hauled him onto the bank. Almost at once, he woke and coughed and sputtered. "Do you know, Sam," he said at length, "that the beastly tree threw me in? I felt it. The big root just twisted around and tipped me in." "You were dreaming, I expect, Mr. Frodo," said Sam. "You shouldn't sit in such a place if you feel sleepy." "What about the others?" Frodo asked. "I wonder what sort of dreams they are having." They went round to the other side of the tree, and then Sam understood the click he had heard. Pippin had vanished. The crack by which he had laid himself had closed together, so that not a chink could be seen. Merry was trapped. The other crack had closed about his wrist. His legs lay outside, but the rest of him was inside a dark opening, the edges of which gripped like a pair of pincers. Frodo and Sam beat first upon the tree trunk where Pippin had lain. They then struggled frantically to pull the jaws of the crack that held poor Merry. It was quite useless. "What a foul thing to happen!" cried Frodo wildly. "Why did we ever come to this dreadful forest? I wish we were all back at Cricket Hollow." He kicked the tree with all his strength, heedless of his own feet. The hardly perceptible shiver ran through the stem and up onto the branches. The leaves rustled and whispered, but with a sound now of faint, far-off laughter. "I suppose we haven't gotten an axe among our luggage, Mr. Frodo?" asked Sam. "I brought a little hatchet for chopping firewood," said Frodo. "That wouldn't be much use." "Wait a minute," cried Sam, struck by an idea suggested by firewood. "We might do something with fire." "We might," said Frodo doubtfully. "We might succeed in roasting Pippin alive inside." "We might try to hurt or frighten this tree to begin with," said Sam fiercely. "If it don't let them go, I'll have it down, if I have to gnaw at it." He ran to the ponies, and before long came back with 2 tinder boxes and a hatchet. Quickly, they gathered dry leaves and grass and bits of bark, and they made a pile of broken twigs and chopsticks. There they heaped against the trunk of the far side of the tree from the prisoners. As soon as Sam had struck a spark to the tinder, it kindled the dry grass in a flurry of flame, and smoke went up. The twigs crackled, little fingers of fire licked against the dry sword rind of the ancient tree that scorched it. A tremor ran through the whole willow. The leaves seemed to hiss above their heads with a sound of pain and anger. A scream loud came from Mary, and far inside the tree they heard Pippin give a muffled yell. "Put it out! Put it out!" cried Mary. "He'll squeeze me in two if you don't. He says so." "Who? What?" shouted Frodo, rushing to the round other side of the tree. "Put it out! Put it out!" begged Mary. The branches of the willow began to sway violently. There was a sound as of the wind rising, spreading outwards to the branches of all the other trees round about, as though they had dropped a stone into the quiet slumber of the river valley, and set up ripples of anger that ran out over the whole forest. Sam kicked at the little fire and stamped out the sparks, but Frodo, without any clear idea of why he did so or what he had hoped for, ran along the path crying, "Help! Help! Help!" It seemed to him that he could hardly hear the sound of his own shrill voice. It was blown away from him by the willow wind and drowned in clamor of leaves. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt desperate, lost, and witless. Suddenly he stopped. There was an answer, or so he thought, but it seemed to come from behind him, way down the path, further back in the forest. He turned round and listened, and soon there could be no doubt someone was singing a song. A deep, glad voice was singing carelessly and happily, but it was singing nonsense. "Hey doll, Mary doll, ring-a-dong dillo, ring-a-dong hop along, fal-lal the willow, tom-bomb dolly tom, tom-bombadillo." Half hopeful and half afraid of some new danger, Frodo and Sam now both stood still. Suddenly, out of a long string of nonsense words, or so they seemed, the voice rose up loud and clear and burst into the song. "Hey, Mary, come do, dearie dole, my darling. Light goes the weather wind and the feathered starling, down along under the hill, shining in the sunlight, waiting on the doorstep for the cold starlight. There my pretty lady is, river woman's daughter, slender as the willow hand, clearer than the water. Old Tom Bombadil, water lilies bringing, coming hopping home again. Can you hear him singing? Hey, come Mary doll, dairy doll, and Mary-O, goldberry, goldberry, Mary yellow Mary-O. Poor woman willow man, you tuck your roots away. Tom's in a hurry now, evening will follow day. Tom's going home again, water lilies bringing. Hey, come dairy doll, can you hear me singing?" Frodo and Sam stood as if enchanted. The wind puffed out, the leaves hung silently again on stiff branches. There was another burst of a song, and then suddenly, hopping and dancing along the path, there appeared above the reeds an old, battered hat with a tall crown and a long blue feather stuck in the band. With another hop and a bound, there came into view a man, or so it seemed. At any rate, he was too large and heavy for a hobbit, if not quite tall enough for one of the big people, though he made noise enough for one, stumping along with great yellow boots on his thick legs, and charging through the grass and rushes like a cow going down to drink. He had a blue coat and a long brown beard. His eyes were blue and bright, and his face was red as ripe apple. but creased into 100 wrinkles of laughter. In his hands he carried on a large leaf, as on a tray of a small pile of white water lilies. "Help!" cried Frodo and Sam, running towards him with their hands stretched out. "Whoa, whoa, steady there!" cried the old man, holding up one hand, and they suddenly stopped short, as if they had been struck stiff. "Now, my little fellows, where be you a-goin', puffin' like a bellows? What's the matter there, then? Do you know who I am? I'm Tom Bombadil. Tell me what's your trouble. Tom's in a hurry now. Don't you crush my lilies." "My friends are caught in the willow tree," cried Frodo, breathlessly. "Master Merry's been squeezing in a crack," cried Sam. "What?" shouted Tom Bombadil, leaping in the air. "Old Man Willow? Not worse than that, eh? Can soon be mended. I know the tune for him, old gray willow man. I'll sing his roots off. I'll sing a wind up and blow a leaf and branch away. Old Man Willow." Setting down his lilies carefully on the grass, he ran to the tree. Here he saw Mary's feet sticking out. The rest had already been drawn further inside. Tom has put his mouth to the crack and began singing into it in a low voice. They could not catch the words, but evidently Mary was aroused. His legs began to kick. Tom sprang away and, beginning to break off a hanging branch, smote the side of the willow with it. "You let them out again, old man Willow," he said. "What you a-thinking? You should not be waking. Eat earth, dig deep, drink water, go to sleep. Bombadil is talking." Then he seized Mary's feet and drew him out of the suddenly widening crack. There was a tearing creak, and the other crack split open, and out of it Pippin sprang, as if he had been kicked. Then, with a loud snap, both cracks closed fast again. A shudder ran through the tree from root to tip, and complete silence fell. "Thank you," said the hobbits, one after the other. Tom Bombadil burst out laughing. "Well, my little fellows," he said, stooping so that he peered into their faces, "you shall come home with me. The table is all laden with yellow cream, honeycomb, and white bread and butter. Goldberry is waiting. Time enough for questions around the supper table. You will follow me as quick as you are able." With that, he picked up his lilies, and then with a beckoning wave of his hand, went hopping and dancing along the path eastward, still singing loudly and nonsensically. Too surprised and too relieved to talk, the hobbits followed him as fast as they could, but that was not fast enough. Tom soon disappeared in front of them, and the noise of his singing got fainter and further away. Suddenly, his voice came floating to them in a loud halloo. "Hop along, my little friends, up the withy windle. Tom's going on ahead, candles for to kindle. Down west sinks the sun, soon you'll be groping. When the night shadows fall, then the door will open. Out of the window panes light will twinkle yellow. Fear no alder black, heed no hoary willow. Fear neither root nor bough, time goes on for you. Hey now, merry dole, we'll be waiting for you." After that, the hobbits heard no more. Almost as once the sun seemed to sink into the trees behind them, they thought of the slanting light of evening glittering on the Brandywine River, and the windows of Buckleberry began to gleam with hundreds of lights. Great shadows fell across them. Trunks and branches of trees hung dark and threatening over the path. White mists began to rise and curl on the surface of the river, and stray about the roots of the trees upon its borders. Out of the very ground, at their feet, Shadowy steam arose and mingled with the swiftly falling dusk. It became difficult to follow the path, and they were very tired. Their legs seemed leaden. Strange furtive noises ran among the bushes and the reeds on either side of them. And if they looked up to the pale sky, they caught sight of queer, gnarled, and knobbly faces that gloomed dark against the twilight and leered down at them from on the high bank to the edges of the wood. They began to feel that all this country was unreal. They were stumbling through an ominous dream that led to no wakening. Just as they felt their feet slowing down into a standstill, they noticed that the ground was gently rising. The water began to murmur. In the darkness, they caught the white glimmer of foam where the river flowed over a short fall. Then suddenly, the trees came to an end, and the mists were left behind. They stepped out from the forest and found a wide seep of grass welling before them. The river, now small and swift, was leaping merrily down to meet them, glinting here and there in the light of stars, which were already shining in the sky. The grass under their feet was smooth and short, as if it had been mown or shaven. The eaves of the forest behind were clipped and trimmed as a hedge. The path was now plain before them, well tended and bordered with stone. It rounded up onto the top of the grassy knoll, now gray under the pale, starry night. And there, still high above them on a further slope, they saw the twinkling lights of a house. Down again the path went, and then up again, a long, smooth hillside of turf towards the light. Suddenly, a wide, yellow beam flowed out brightly from a door that was open. There was Tom Bilbadill's house, before them, up, down, under a hill. Behind it, a steep shoulder of the land lay gray and bare, and beyond that the dark shapes of the Barrow Downs stalked away into the eastern night. They all hurried forward, hobbits and ponies. Already half their weariness and all their fears had fallen from them. "Hey, come merry dole," rolled around the song to greet them. "Hey, come merry dole, hop along my hearties. Hobbits, ponies all, we are fond of parties. Now let the fun begin, let us sing together." Then another clear voice, as young and as ancient as spring, like the song of a glad water flowing down the night from a bright morning in the hills, came falling like silver to meet them. "Now let the song begin, let us sing together. The sun, stars, moon, and mist, rain and cloudy weather, light on the budding leaf, dew on the feather, wind on the open hill, bells on the heather, reeds by the shady pool, lilies on the water, old Tom Bombadil and the river daughter." And with that, the song, the hobbits stood upon the thresholds, and a golden light was all about them. That's the end of chapter 6. I'm gonna quickly eat some of my ramen. Okay. Much better. I'm sorry for the coughing. Alright. I feel like my nose is very stuffy. Alright. Chapter 7. In the House of Tom Bombadil. The four hobbits stepped over the wide stone threshold and stood still, blinking. They were in a long, low room, filled with the light of lamps swinging from the beams of the roof. And on the table of the dark, polished wood stood many candles, tall and yellow, burning brightly. In a chair at the far end of the room, facing the outer door, sat a woman. Her long yellow hair rippled down her shoulders. Her gown was green as young reeds, shot with silver like beads of dew. And her belt was of gold, shaped like a chain of flag lilies, set with the pale blue eyes of the forget-me-nots. About her feet, in wide vessels of green and brown earthenware, white water lilies were floating, so that she seemed to be enthroned in the midst of a pool. "Enter, good guests," she said. As she spoke, they knew that it was clear her voice they heard was singing. They came a few timid steps further into the room and began to bow low, feeling strangely surprised and awkward, like folk that knocking at a cottage door to beg for water have been answered by a fair young elf queen clad in living flowers. But before they could say anything, she sprang lightly up and over the lily bowls and ran laughing towards them. And as she ran over, her gown rustled softly like a wind in the flowering borders in the river. "Come, dear folk," she said, taking Frodo by the hand. "Laugh and be merry. I am Goldberry, daughter of the river." Then lightly she passed them, and closing the door, she turned her back to it, with her white arms spread out across it. "Let us shut out the night," she said, "for you are still afraid, perhaps, of mist and tree shadows and deep water and untamed things. Fear nothing, for tonight you are under the roof of Tom Bombadil." The hobbits looked at her in wonder, and she looked at each other and smiled. "Fair Lady Goldberry," said Frodo at last, feeling his heart moved with a joy that he did not understand. He stood as he had many times stood, enchanted by fair elven voices, but the spell that was now laid upon him was different. Less keen and lofty was the delight, but deeper and nearer to mortal hearts. Marvelous and not strange. "Fair Lady Goldberry," he said again, "now the joy that was hidden in the songs we heard is made plain to me. O slender as a willow wand, O clearer than clear water, O reed by the living pool, fair river daughter, O springtime and summertime, and spring again after, O wind on the waterfall, and the leaves' laughter." Suddenly he stopped and stammered, overcome with surprise to hear himself saying such things, but Goldberry laughed. "Welcome," she said. "I had not heard that folk in the Shire were so sweet-tongued, but I see you are an elf friend. The light in your eyes and the ring in your voice tells it. This is a merry meeting. Sit now, and let us wait for the master of the house. He will not be long. He is tending to your tired beasts." The hobbits sat down gladly in low, rush-seated chairs, while Goldberry busied herself about the table, and their eyes followed her, for the slender grace of her movement filled them with a quiet delight. From somewhere behind the house came the sound of singing. Every now and again they caught, among the many, a dairy-dole and a merry dairy-dole, and a ring-a-ding-dillo, repeated words. Old Tom Bombadil is a merry fellow. Bright blue his jacket is, and his boots are yellow. Fair lady, said Frodo again after a while, tell me, if my asking does not seem foolish, who is Tom Bombadil? He is, said Goldberry, staying her swift movements and smiling. Frodo looked at her questioningly. He is, as you have seen him, she said in answer to his look. He is the master of wood, water, and hill. Then all of this strange land belongs to him? No, indeed, she answered, and her smile faded. That would indeed be a burden, she added in a low voice, as if to herself. The trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under the light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master. A door opened, and in came Tom Bombadil. He had no hat, and his thick brown hair was crowned with autumn leaves. He laughed, and going to Goldberry, he took her hand. Here is my pretty lady, he said, bowing to the hobbits. Here's my Goldberry, clothed in all silver green, with flowers in her girdle. Is the table laden? I see yellow cream, and honeycomb, and white bread, and butter, milk, cheese, and green herbs, and ripe berries gathered. Is that enough for us? Is the supper ready? It is, said Goldberry, but the guests perhaps are not. Tom clapped his hands and cried, Tom, Tom, your guests are tired, and you had near forgotten. Come now, my merry friends, and Tom will refresh you. You shall clean your grimy hands, and wash your weary faces, cast off your muddy cloaks, and come out of your tangles. He opened the door, and they followed him down a short passage and a round sharp turn. They came into a low room with a sloping roof. A penthouse, it seemed, built into the north end of the house. Its walls were of clean stone, but they were mostly covered with green hanging mats and yellow curtains. The floor was flagged and strewn with fresh green rushes. There were 4 deep mattresses, each piled with white blankets, laid on the floor along one side. I lost my place. Against the opposite wall was a long bench laden with wide earthenware basins, and beside it stood brown ewers filled with water, some cold, some steaming hot. There were soft green slippers ready beside each bed. Before long, washed and refreshed, the hobbits were seated at the table, 2 on each side, while at either end sat Goldberry and the master. It was a long and merry meal. Though the hobbits ate, as only famished hobbits can eat, there was no lack. The drink in their drinking bowls seemed to be clear, cold water, yet it went to their hearts like wine and set their voices free. The guests became suddenly aware that they were singing merrily, as if it was easier than more natural than talking. At last, Tom and Goldberry rose and cleared the table swiftly. The guests were commanded to sit quiet and were set in chairs, each with a footstool to his tired feet. There was a fire in the wide hearth before them, and it was burning with a sweet smell, as if it was built of apple wood. With everything was set in order, all the lights in their room were put out, except one lamp and a pair of candles at each end of the chimney shelf. Then Goldberry came and stood before them, holding a candle, and she wished them each a good night and deep sleep. "Have peace now," she said, "until the morning. Heed no nightly noises, for nothing passes door and window here save moonlight and starlight and the wind off the top hill. Good night." She passed out of the room with a glimmer and a rustle, the sound of her footsteps like stream falling gently away down river over the cool stones in the quiet of night. Tom sat out for a while beside them in silence, while each of them tried to muster the courage to ask one of the many questions he had meant to ask at supper. Sleep gathered on their eyelids. At last, Frodo spoke. "Did you hear me calling, Master? Or was it just chance that brought you at the moment?" Tom stirred like a man shaken out of a pleasant dream. What?" said he. "Did I hear you calling?" "Nay, I did not hear. I was busy singing. Just chance brought me then, if chance you call it. It was no plan of mine, though I was waiting for you. We heard news of you, and learned that you were wandering. We guessed you'd come ere long down to the water. All paths lead that way, down to Withywindle. Old Grey Willow Man, he's a mighty singer, and it's hard for little folk to escape his cunning mazes. But Tom had an errand there, and he dared not to hinder." Tom nodded as if sleep was taking him again, but he went on in a soft, singing voice. "I had an errand there, gathering water lilies, green leaves and lilies white to pleasure my pretty lady, the last ere the year's end, to keep them from the winter, to flower by her pretty feet till the snows are melted. Each year, at summer's end, I go to find them for her. In a wide pool, deep and clear, for down Withywindle, they were open first in spring, and there they linger latest. By that pool long ago I found the river daughter, fair young Goldberry, sitting in the rushes. Sweet was her singing then, and her heart was beating." He opened his eyes and looked at them with a sudden glint of blue. "And that proved well for you, for now I shall no longer go down deep again along the forest water, not while the year is old, nor shall I be passing Old Man Willow's house this side of springtime, not till the merry spring, when the river daughter dances down the withy path to bathe in the water." He fell silent again, but Frodo could not help asking one more question, the one he most desired to have answered. "Tell us, Master," he said, "about the Willow Man. What is he? I have never heard of him before." "No, don't," said Merry and Pippin together, suddenly sitting upright. "Not now, not until the morning." "That's right," said the old man. "Now is the time for resting. Some things are ill to hear when the world's in shadow. Sleep till the morning light, rest on the pillow, heed no nightly noise, fear no Grey Willow." And with that, he took down the lamp and blew it out. Grasping a candle in either hand, he led them out of the room. Their mattresses and pillows were soft as down, as the blankets were of white wool. They had hardly laid themselves on the deep beds and drawn the light covers over them, before they were asleep. In the dead night, Frodo lay in a dream, without light. Then he saw the young moon rising. Under its thin light, they loomed before him in a black wall of rock, pierced by a dark arch like a great gate.
It seemed to Frodo that he was lifted up, and passing over he saw that the rock wall was a circle of hills, and that within it was a plain, and in the midst of the plain stood a pinnacle of stone, like a vast tower, but not made by hands. On its top stood the figure of a man. The moon, as it rose, seemed to hang for a moment above his head and glistening in his white hair as the wind stirred up. From the dark plain below them came crying of fell voices and the howling of many wolves. Suddenly a shadow like the shape of great wings passed across the moon. The figure lifted his arms and a light flashed from the staff that he wielded. A mighty eagle swept down and bore him away. The voices wailed and the wolves yammered. There was a noise of hooves galloping, galloping, galloping from the east. Black riders, thought Frodo as he wakened, with the sound of hooves still echoing in his mind. He wondered if he would ever again have the courage to leave the safety of these stone walls. He lay motionless, still listening, but all was now silent, and at last he turned and fell asleep again, or wandered into some other unremembered dream. At his side, Pippin lay dreaming pleasantly, but a change came over his dreams, and he turned and groaned. Suddenly he woke, or thought he had waked, and yet still heard in the darkness the sound that had disturbed his dream. Tip, tap, squeak. The noise was like branches fretting in the wind, twig fingers scraping wall and window. Creak, creak, creak. He wondered if there were willow trees close to the house, and then suddenly he had a dreadful feeling that he was not in an ordinary house at all, but inside the willow, and listening to that horrible, dry, creaking voice laughing at him again. He sat up and felt the soft pillows yield to his hands, and he lay down again. Relieved. He seemed to hear the echo of words in his ears. Fear nothing. Have peace until the morning. Heed no nightly noises. Then he went to sleep again. It was the sound of water that Merry heard falling into his quiet sleep. Water streaming down gently, then spreading irresistibly all around the house into the dark, shoreless pool. It gurgled under the walls. It was rising slowly but surely. I shall be drowned, he thought. It will find its way in, and then I shall drown. He felt that he was lying in a soft, slimy bog, and springing up, he set his foot on the corner of the cold, hard flagstone. Then he remembered where he was, and lay down again. He seemed to hear, or remember hearing, nothing past his doors or windows save moonlight and starlight and the wind off the hilltop. A little breath of sweet air moved the curtain. He breathed deep and fell asleep again. As far as he could remember, Sam slept through the night in deep content, if logs are contented. They woke up, all four at once, in the morning light. Tom was moving about the room, whistling like a starling. When he heard them stir, he clapped his hands and cried, "Hey, come merry dole, dairy dole, my hearties." He drew back the yellow curtains, and the hobbits saw that these had covered the windows at either end of the room, one looking east and the other looking west. They leapt up, refreshed. Frodo ran to the eastern window and found himself looking into a kitchen garden gray with dew. He had half expected to see turf right up to the walls, turf all pocked with hoof prints. Actually, his view was screened by a tall line of beams on poles, but above the far and beyond them, the gray top of the hill loomed up against the sunrise. It was a pale morning in the east. Beyond, long clouds, like lines of soil wool stained red at the edges, lay glimmering deeps of yellow. The sky spoke of rain to come, but the light was broadening quickly, and the red flowers on the beams began to glow against the wet green leaves. Pippin looked out of the western window, down into a pool of mist. The forest was hidden under a fog. It was like looking down onto a sloping cloud roof from above. There was a fold or channel from where the mist was broken into many plumes and billows. The valley of the Withywindle. The stream ran down the hill and on the left and vanished into the white shadows. Near at the hand was a flower garden and a clipped hedge, silver-netted, and beyond that, gray, shaven grass, pale with dewdrops. There was no willow tree to be seen. "Good morning, merry friends," cried Tom, opening the eastern window wide. A cool air flowed in. It had a rainy smell. "Sun won't show her face much today, I'm thinking. I have been walking wide, leaping on the hilltops since the gray dawn began, nosing wind and weather, wet grass underfoot, wet sky above me. I wakened Goldberry singing under the window, but the knout wakes hobbit folk in the early morning."
Al_Diaballos_resubscribed for 23 months. Where do rainbows go? To prison. It's a light sentence, but it gives them time to reflect.
It's a very good dad joke. I appreciate that. Thank you for the resub, Diablo. You've almost been subbed for 2 whole years. Thank you so much. I lost my place. Oh. I wakened Goldberry singing under the window, but the note wakes hobbit folk in the early morning. In the night, little folk wake up in the darkness and sleep after light has come. Ring-a-ding-dillo, wake now, my merry friends. Forget the nightly noises. Ring-a-ding-dillo-dell, derry-dell, my hearties. If you come soon, you'll find breakfast on the table. If you come late, you'll get grass and rainwater. Needless to say, not that Tom's threat sounded very serious, the hobbits came soon and left the table late, and only when it was beginning to look rather empty. Neither Tom nor Goldberry were there. Tom could be heard about the house, clattering in the kitchen, and up and down the stairs, and singing here and there outside. The room looked westward, over the mist-clouded valley, and the windows was open. Water dripped down from the thatched eaves above. Before they had finished breakfast, the clouds had joined into an unbroken roof, and a straight, gray rain came softly and steadily down. Behind its deep curtain, the forest was completely veiled. As they looked out the window, there came gently falling, as if it was flowing down from the rain out of the sky, the clear voice of Goldberry singing up above them. They could hear few words, but it seemed plain to them that the song was a rain song, as sweet as showers on dry hills, that told the tale of a river from the spring in the highlands to the sea far below. The hobbits listened with delight, and Frodo was glad in his heart, and blessed in the kindly weather because it delayed them from departing. The thought of going had been heavy upon him, and from the moment he awoke, but he guessed now that they would not go further that day. Ooh, shit, I'm so sorry. episode intended. The upper wind settled in the west, and deeper and wetter clouds rolled up to spill their laden rain on the bare heads of downs. Nothing could be seen all around the house but falling water. Frodo stood near the open door and watched the white, chalky path turn into a little river of milk and go bubbling away down into the valley. Tom Bombadil came trotting around the corner of the house, waving his arms as if he was warding off the rain. And indeed, when he sprang over the threshold, he seemed quite dry, except for his boots. These he took off and put in the chimney corner. Then he sat in the largest chair and called the hobbits to gather round him. "This is Goldberry's washing day," he said, "and her autumn cleaning. Too wet for hobbit folk. Let them rest while they're able. It's a good day for long tales, for questions, and for answers, so Tom will start the talking." Then he told them the many remarkable stories, sometimes half as if speaking to himself, sometimes looking at them, suddenly with a bright blue eye under his deep brows. Often his voice would turn to song, and he would get out of the chair and dance about. He told them tales of bees and flowers, the way the trees and the strange creatures of the forest, about the evil things and good things, things friendly and things unfriendly, cruel things and kind things, and secrets hidden under brambles. As they listened, they began to understand the lives of the forest apart from themselves, indeed, to feel themselves as strangers where all the other things were at home. Moving constantly in and out of his talk was Old Man Willow, and Frodo learned now enough to content him. Indeed, more was enough, for it was not comfortable lore. Tom's words lay bare the hearts of trees and their thoughts, which were often dark and strange, and filled with a hatred of things that go free upon the earth, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning, destroyers and usurpers. It was not called the Old Forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods, and in it there lived yet, aging no quicker than the hills, the fathers of trees, remembering times when they were lords. The countless years that had filled them with pride and rooted wisdom and with malice. But none were more dangerous than the great willow. His heart was rotten, but his strength was green, and he was cunning, and a master of winds. And his song, and though ran through the woods on both sides of the river. His gray, thirsty spirit drew power out of the earth and spread like fine-rooted threads in the ground and visible twig fingers in the air, till it had under its dominion nearly all the trees of the forest, from the hedge to the downs. Suddenly, Tom's talk left the woods and went leaping up the young stream over bubbling waterfalls, over petals and worn rocks, and among the small flowers and close grass and wet crannies, wandering up the last to the downs. They heard the great barrows and the green mounds and the stone rings upon the hills and the hollows among the hills. Sheep were bleating in the flocks, green walls and white walls rose. They were fortresses on the heights. Kings of little kingdoms fought together, and the young sun shone like fire on the red metal of their new and greedy swords. There was victory and defeat, and towers fell, fortresses were burned, and flames went up into the sky. Gold was piled on the biers of dead kings and queens, and mounds covered them, and the stone doors were shut, and the grass grew
all over. Sheep walked for a while, biting the grass, but soon the hills were empty again. A shadow came out of a dark place far away, and the bones were stirred in the mounds. Barrow wights walked in the hollow places with a clink of rings on cold fingers and gold chains in the wind. Stone rings grinned out of the ground like broken teeth in the moonlight. The hobbits shuddered. Even in the Shire, the rumor of the Barrow-wights, of the Barrow Downs beyond the forest had been heard, but it was not a tale that any hobbit liked to listen to, even by a comfortable fireside far away. These four now suddenly remembered what the joy of this house had driven from their minds. The house of Tom Bombadil, nestled under the very shoulder of those dreaded hills. They lost the thread of his tale and shifted uneasily, looking aside to one another. When they caught his words again, they found that he had now wandered into strange regions beyond their memory and beyond their waking thought, into times when the world was wider and the seas flowed straight into the western shore, and still on the back, Tom went singing out into ancient starlight, when only the elf sires were awake. Then suddenly he stopped, and they saw that he nodded as if he was falling asleep. The hobbits sat still before him, enchanted, and it seemed as if, under the spell of his words, the wind had gone, and the clouds had dried up, and the day had been withdrawn, and darkness had come from east and west, and all the sky was filled with the light of white stars. Whether the morning or evening of one day or of many days had passed, Frodo could not tell. He did not feel either hungry or tired, only filled with wonder. The stars shone through the window, and the silence of the heavens seemed to be round him. He spoke at last of his wonder, and a sudden fear of that silence. "Who are you, master?" he asked. What?" said Tom, sitting up and his eyes glinting in the gloom. "Don't you know my name yet? That's the only answer. Tell me, who are you? Alone, yourself and nameless? For you are young and I am old. Eldest, that's what I am. Mark my words, my friends. Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the Barrowits. When the elves passed westward, Tom was here already, before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside. A shadow seemed to pass by the window, and the hobbits glanced hastily through the panes. When they turned again, Goldberry stood in the door behind, framed in light. She held a candle, shielding its flame from the draught with her hand, and the light flowed through it, like sunlight through a white shell. "The rain had ended," she said, "and new waters are running downhill under the stars. Let us now laugh and be glad." "And let us have food and drink," cried Tom. "Long tales are thirsty, and long listening's hungry work, morning, noon, and evening." With that, he jumped out of his chair, and with a bound took a candle from the chimney shelf and lit it in the flame that Goldberry held. Then he danced about the table. Suddenly, he hopped through the door and disappeared. Quickly, he returned, bearing a large and laden tray. Then Tom and Goldberry set the table, and the hobbits sat half in wonder and half in laughter. So fair was the grace of Goldberry, and so merry and odd were the caperings of Tom. Yet in some fashion they seemed to weave a single dance, neither hindering the other, and in and out of the room, and round the table with great speed, food and vessels and lights were set in order. The boards blazed with candles, white and yellow. Tom bowed to his guests. "Supper is ready," said Goldberry, and now the hobbits saw that she was clothed in all silver with white girdle, and her shoes were like fish's mail. But Tom was all in clean blue, blue as rain washed forget-me-nots, and he had green stockings. It was a supper even better than before. The hobbits, under the spell of Tom's words, may have missed one meal or many, but when the food was before them, it seemed at least a week since they had eaten. They did not sing or even speak much for a while and paid close attention to business. But after a time, their hearts and spirit rose high again, and their voices rang out in mirth and laughter. After they had eaten, Goldberry sang many songs for them, songs that began merrily in the hills and fell softly down into silence, and then in the silence they saw their minds pool in waters wider than any they had known, and looked into they saw the sky below them and the stars like jewels in the depths. Then once more she wished them each good night and left them by the fireside. But Tom seemed now wide awake and plied them with questions. He appeared already to know much about them and all their families, and indeed to know much about the history and doings of the Shire, down from the days hardly remembered among the hobbits themselves. It no longer surprised them, but he made no secret that he owed his recent knowledge largely to Farmer Maggot, who he seemed to regard as a person of more importance than they had imagined. There's earth under his old feet, and clay on his fingers, wisdom in his bones, and both in his eyes are open, said Tom. It was also clear that Tom had dealings with the elves, and it seemed that in some fashion news had reached him from Gildor concerning the flight of Frodo. Indeed, so much did Tom know, and so cunning was he questioning, that Frodo found himself telling him more about Bilbo and his own hopes and fears than he had told before even to Gandalf. Tommen wagged his head up and down, and there was a glint in his eyes of when he heard of the riders. It seemed to grow larger as it lay for a moment. Oh, I'm so sorry, I skipped like a whole paragraph. I'm so sorry. "Show me the precious ring," he said suddenly in the midst of the story. And Frodo, to his own astonishment, drew out the chain from his pocket and unfastened the ring and handed it at once to Tom. It seemed to grow larger as it lay for a moment on his big, brown-skinned hand. Then suddenly he put it to his eye and laughed. For a second, the hobbits had a vision, both comical and alarming, of his bright blue eye gleaming through a circle of gold. Then Tom put the ring round the end of his little finger and held it up to candlelight. For a moment the hobbits noticed nothing strange about this. Then they gasped. There was no sign of Tom disappearing. Tom laughed again, and then he spun the ring in the air, and then it vanished with a flash. Frodo gave a cry, and Tom leaned forward and handed it back to him with a smile. Frodo looked at it closely and rather suspiciously, like one who had lent a trinket to a juggler. It was the same ring, or looked the same, and weighed the same, for that ring had always seemed to Frodo to weigh strangely heavy in the hand. But when something prompted him to make sure, he was perhaps a trifle annoyed with Tom for seeming to make so light of what even Gandalf thought so perilously important. He waited for an opportunity when the talk was going again, and Tom was telling an absurd story about badgers and their queer ways. Then he slipped the ring on. Mary turned towards him to say something and gave a start, and checked with exclamation. Frodo was delighted in a way. It was his own ring, all right. For Mary was staring blankly at his chair and obviously could not see him. He got up and crept quietly away from the fireside towards the outer door. "Hey there!" cried Tom, glancing towards him with a most seeing look in his shining eyes. "Hey, come Frodo there. Where you be a-going? Old Tom Bombadil's not as blind as that yet. Take off your golden ring. Your hand's more fair without it. Come back. Leave your game and sit down beside me. We must talk a while more, and think about the morning. Tom must reach the right road and keep your feet from wandering." Frodo laughed, trying to feel pleased, and taking off the ring, he came and sat down again. Tom now told them of reckoned with the sun would shine tomorrow, and it would be a glad morning, and setting out would be hopeful. But they would do well to start early, for weather in that country was a thing that even Tom could not be sure of for long, and it would change sometime quicker than he would change his jacket. "I am no weather master," he said, "nor is aught that goes on two legs." By his advice, they decided to make early due north from his house, over the western and lower slopes of downs. They might hope then in a way to strike the eastern road in a day's journey, and avoid the barrows. He told them not to be afraid, but to mind their own business. "Keep to the green grass. Don't you go a-meddling with the old stone or the cold whites, or prying in their houses, unless you be strong folk with hearts that never falter," he said this more than once. And he advised them to pass sparrows by on the west side, if they chanced to stray near one. Then he taught them a rhyme to sing, if they should by ill luck fall into any danger or difficulty the next day. "O Tom Bombadil, Tom Bombadillo, by water, wood, and hill, by reed and willow, by fire and sun and moon, hearken now and hear us. Come, Tom Bombadil, for our need is near us." When they had sung this all together after him, he clapped them each on the shoulder with a laugh, taking candles, led them back to their bedroom. Let me eat a little more of my ramen. That was the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8. Fog on the Barrow Downs. That night they heard no voices, but either in his dreams or out of them, he could not tell which, Frodo heard a sweet singing running in his mind. A song that seemed to come like a pale light behind a gray rain curtain, and growing stronger to turn the veil all to glass and silver, until at last it was rolled back, and a far green country opened before him under a swift sunrise. The vision melted into waking, and there was Tom whistling like a tree full of birds, and the sun was already slanting down the hill and through the open window. Outside everything was green and pale gold. After breakfast, which they again ate alone, they made ready to say farewell, as nearly heavy of heart was the possible of such a morning. Cool, bright, and clean, under the washed autumn sky of thin blue. The air came from fresh of the northwest. Their quiet ponies were almost frisky, sniffing and moving restlessly. Tom came out of the house and waved his hat and danced upon the doorstep, bidding the hobbits to get up and be off and go with Godspeed. They rode off along a path that wound away from behind the house and went slanting up towards the north end of the hillbrow under which it had sheltered. It had just dismounted to lead their ponies up the last steep slope when suddenly Frodo stopped. "Goldberry," he cried, "my fair lady, clad in all silver green, we have never said farewell to her, nor seen her since the evening." He was so distressed that he turned back, but at that moment a clear call came rippling down. There, on the hill brow, she had stood beckoning to them. Her hair was flying loose. As it caught in the sun, it shone and shimmering. A light like a glint of water on dewy grass flashed from under her feet as she danced. They hastened up the last slope and stood breathless beside her. They bowed, but with a wave of her arm, she bade them look round, and they looked around out from the hilltop over the lands of the morning. It was now as clear as and far seen as had been veiled and misty when they stood upon the knoll in the forest, which would now be seen rising pale and green out of the dark trees in the west. In that direction, the land rose in wooden ridges, green, yellow, russet under the sun, beyond which lay hidden in the valley of Brandywine. To the south, over the line of the Withywindle, there was a distant glint like a pale glass, where the Brandywine River made a great loop in the lowlands, and flowed out of the knowledge of the hobbits. Northward, beyond the dwindling downs, the land ran away in the flats and swellings of gray and green and pale earth colors, until it faded into featurelessness in the shadowy distance. Eastward, the Barrow Downs rose, rigid, behind ridge into the morning, and vanished out of eyesight into a guess. It was no more than a guess of blue and a remote white glimmer, bending with the hem of the sky, but it spoke to them out of memory and old tales of the high and distant mountains. They took a deep breath of the air and felt that Skip and few stout rides would bear whatever they had wished. It seemed faint-hearted to go jogging aside over the crumpled skirts of the downs towards the road, when they should be leaping as lusty as Tom over the stepping stones and hills straight towards the mountains. Goldberry spoke to them and recalled their eyes and thoughts. "Speed now, Pharaoh Guess," she said, "and hold to your purpose. North with the wind, in the left eye, and a blessing on your footsteps. Make haste while the sun shines." And to Frodo she said, "Farewell, elf friend. It was a merry meeting." But Frodo found no words to answer. He bowed low and mounted his pony, and followed by his friends, jogged slowly down the gentle slope behind the hill. Tom Bombadil's house and the valley and the forest were lost to view. The air grew warmer between the green walls of hillside and hillside, and the scent of turf rose strong and sweet as they breathed. Turning back when they reached the bottom of the green hollow, they saw Goldberry, now smaller and slender, like a sunlit flower against the sky. She was standing still, watching them, and her hands were stretched out towards them. As they looked, she gave a clear call and lifted up her hand. She turned and vanished behind the hill. Their way wound along the floor of the hollow and round the green feet of a steep hill into another deeper and broader valley, and then over the shoulder of the furthest hills, down their long limbs and up their smooth sides again, up to the new hilltops and down into the new valleys. There were no tree nor any visible water. It was a country of grass and short, springy turf. silent except for the whisper of air over the edges of the land, and high, lonely cries of strange birds. As they journeyed, the sun mounted and grew hot. Each time they climbed a ridge, the breeze seemed to have grown less. When they caught a glimpse of the country westward, the forest seemed to be smoking, as if the fallen rain was steaming up again from leaf and root and mold. A shadow now lay round the edge of sight, a dark haze above which the upper sky was like a blue cap, hot and heavy. About midday, they came to a hill whose top was wide and flattened, like a shallow saucer with a green mounted rim. Inside, there were no air stirring, and the sky seemed to be their heads. They rode across and looked northwards. Then their hearts rose, for it seemed plain that they had come further already than they had expected. Certainly, the distance had now all become hazy and deceptive. But there could be no doubt the downs were coming to an end. A long valley lay below them, winding in northwards until it came to an opening between two steep shoulders. Beyond there seemed to be no more hills. Due north they faintly glimpsed a dark line. "That is a line of trees," said Mary, "and that must mark the road. All along it for many leagues east of the bridge there are trees growing. Some say they planted it in old days." "Splendid," said Frodo. "If we make good going afternoon, If we make as good going afternoon as we have done this morning, we shall have left the downs before the sun sets and be jogging on in search of camping place." But even as he spoke, he turned his glance eastwards, and he saw that on the side of the hills were higher and looked down upon them. And all those hills were crowned with green mounds, and on some they were standing stones, pointing upwards like jagged teeth out of green gums. That view was somehow disquieting, so they turned from the sight and went down into the hollow circle. In the midst there stood a single stone, standing tall under the sun above, and at this hour casting no shadow. It was shapeless, yet significant, like a landmark or a guarding finger, or more like a warning. But now they were hungry, and the sun was still at fearless noon, so they set their backs against the east side of the stone. It was cool, as if the sun had no power to warm it, but at that time it seemed pleasant. There they took food and drink and made as good as a noon meal under the open sky as anyone could wish. The food had came from down under hill. Tom had provided them with plenty for the comfort of the day, their ponies unburdened, straying upon the grass. Riding over the hills and eating their fill, the warm sun and the scent of turf lying a little too long, stretching out their legs, and looking at the sky above their noses, these things are, perhaps, enough to explain what happened. However that may be, they woke suddenly and uncomfortably from a sleep they had never meant to take. The standing stone was cold. It cast a long, pale shadow that stretched eastward over them. The sun, a pale and watery yellow, was gleaming through the mist just above the west wall of the hollows which lay north, south, and east. Beyond the wall, the fog was thick, cold, and white. The air was silent, heavy, and chill. Their ponies were standing crowded together, with their heads down. The hobbits sprang to their feet in alarm and ran to the western rim. They found that they were upon an island in the fog. Even as they looked out in dismay towards the setting sun, it sank before their eyes into a white sea, and a cold gray shadow sprang up in the east behind. The fog rolled up to the walls and rose above them, as if it mounted and bent over their heads until it became a roof, where they were shut in a hall of mist, whose central pillar was the standing stone. They felt as if a trap was closing about them, but they did not quite lose heart. They still remembered the hopeful view that they had of the line of the road ahead, and they still knew in which direction it lay. In any case, now that they had so great distance for that hollow place about the stone that no thought remaining there was in their minds, they packed up as quickly as their chilled fingers would work. Soon they were leading their ponies in single file over the rim and down the long northward slope of the hill, down into a foggy sea. As they went down, the mist became colder and damper, and and their hair hung lank and dripping on their foreheads. When they reached the bottom, it was so cold they halted and got out cloaks and hoods, which soon became bedewed with gray drops. Then, mounting their ponies, they went slowly on again, feeling their way by the rise and fall of the ground. They were steering, as well as they could guess, for the gate-like opening at the far northward end of the long valley which they had seen in the morning. Once they were through the gap, they had only to keep on anything like a straight line, and they were bound in the end to strike the road. Their thoughts did not go beyond that, except for a vague hope that perhaps away beyond the downs there might be no fog. Their going was very slow. To prevent their getting separated and wandering in different directions, they went in a file, with Frodo leading. Sam was behind him, and after him came Pippin and then Merry. The valley seemed to stretch on endlessly. Suddenly Frodo saw a hopeful sign. On either side of the darkness began to loom through the mist, and he guessed that they were at last approaching the gap in the hills, the north gate of the Barrow Downs. If they could pass that, they would be free. "Come on, follow me," he called back over his shoulder, and he hurried forward, but his hope soon changed to bewilderment and alarm. The dark patches grew darker, but they shrank, and suddenly he saw, towering ominous before him and leaning slightly towards one another, like the pillars of a headless door, two huge standing stones. He could not remember having seen any sign of these in the valley. When he looked out from the hill in the morning, he had passed between them almost before he was aware. And even as he did, so darkness seemed to fall around him. His pony reared and snorted, and he fell off. When he looked back, he found that he was alone. The others had not followed him. "Sam," he called. "Pippin, Merry, come along. Why don't you keep up?" There was no answer. Fear took him, and he ran back past the stones, shouting wildly, "Sam! Sam! Merry! Pippin!" The pony bolted into the mist and vanished. From some way off, or so it seemed, he thought he heard a cry. "Hoy, Frodo, hoy!" It was away eastward, on his left, as he stood under the great stones, staring and straining into the gloom. He plunged off in the direction of the call, and found himself going steeply uphill. I'm yawning so much. As he struggled on, he called again, and kept calling more and more frantically, but he heard no answer for some time, and then it seemed to faint and far ahead and high above him. "Frodo, hoy!" came the thin voices of the mist, and then a cry that sounded like "Help! Help!" often repeated, ending with a last "Help!" that trailed off into a long wail, suddenly cut short. He stumbled forward with all the speed that could toward the cries, but the light was now gone, and clinging night had closed about him, so that it was impossible to be sure of any direction. He seemed all the time to be climbing up and up. The only change in the level of the ground at his feet told him where he last came to the top of a ridge or hill. He was weary, sweating, yet chilled. It was wholly dark. "Where are you?" he cried out miserably. There was no reply. He stood listening. He was suddenly aware that it was getting very cold, and that up here a wind was beginning to blow, an icy wind. A change was coming in the weather. The mist was flowing past him now in shreds and tatters. His breath was smoking, and the darkness was less near and thick. He looked up and saw the surprise that faint stars were appearing overhead amid the strands of hurrying cloud and fog. The wind began to hiss over the grass. He imagined suddenly that he caught a muffled cry, and he made towards it. And even as he went forward, the mist rolled up and thrust aside, and the starry sky was unveiled. A glance showed him that he was now facing southwards, was on a round hilltop, which he must have climbed from north. Out of the east, the biting wind was blowing. To his right, there loomed against the westward stars a dark black shape. A great barrow stood there. "Where are you?" he cried again, both angry and afraid. "Here," said a voice, deep and cold, that seemed to come out of the ground. "I am waiting for you." "No," said Frodo, but he did not run away. His knees gave, and he fell on the ground. Nothing happened, and there was no sound. Trembling, he looked up in time to see a dark figure like a shadow against the stars. It leaned over him. He thought there were two eyes, very cold though, lit with a pale light that seemed to come from some remote distance. Then a grip stronger and colder than iron seized him. Icy touch froze his bones, and he remembered no more. When he came to himself again, for a moment, he could recall nothing except a sense of dread. Then suddenly he knew that he was imprisoned, hopelessly. He was in a barrow. A Barrow-wight had taken him, and he was probably already under the dreadful spells of the Barrow-wights, about which whispers tales spoke. He dared not to move, but lay as he found himself, flat on his back on a cold stone, with his hands on his breasts. But though his fear was so great, it had seemed to be part of the very darkness that was around him. He found himself as he lay thinking about Bilbo Baggins and his stories, of their jogging along together in the lanes of the Shire, and talking about roads and adventures. There is a seed of courage hidden, often deeply, it is true, in the heart of the fattest and most timid hobbit, waiting for some final and desperate danger to make it grow. Frodo was neither fat nor very timid. Indeed, he did not know it. Bilbo and Gandalf had thought him the best hobbit in the Shire. He thought he had come to the end of his adventure, and a terrible end, but the thought hardened him. He found himself stiffening, as if for a final spring. He felt no longer limp, like helpless prey. As he lay there, thinking and getting a hold of himself, he noticed that all at once the darkness was slowly giving way. A pale, greenish light was growing round him. It did not at first show him what kind of place he was in, for the light seemed to be coming out of himself and from the floor beside him. It had not yet reached the roof or wall. He turned, and there in cold glow he lay lying beside him, Sam, Pippin, and Merry. They were on their backs, and their faces looked deathly pale, and they were in clad white. About them lay many treasures, of gold maybe, though in the light they looked cold and unlovely. On their heads were circlets, gold chains, were about their wrists, and on their fingers were many rings. Swords lay by their sides, and shields were at their feet, but across their 3 necks lay one long, naked sword. Suddenly, a song began, a cold murmur, rising and falling. The voice seemed far away and immeasurably dreary, sometimes high in the air and thin, sometimes like a low moan from the ground. Out of the formless stream of sad but horrible sounds, strings of words would now and again shape themselves, grim, hard, cold words, heartless and miserable. The night was railing against the morning of which it was bereaved, and the cold was cursing the warmth for which it hungered. Frodo was chilled to the marrow. After a while, the song became clearer, and with dread in his heart, he perceived that it had changed into an incantation. Cold be hand and heart and bone, and cold be sleep under stone. Never more to wake on stony bed, never till the sun fails and the moon is dead. In the black wind the stars shall die, and still on gold here let them lie, till dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land. He heard behind his head a creaking and a scraping sound. Raising himself on one arm, he looked and saw now in pale light that they were in kind of a passage, which behind them turned a corner. Round the corner a long arm was groping, walking on its fingers towards Sam, who was lying nearest, and towards the hilt, the sword that lay upon him. At first Frodo felt as if he indeed had been turned to stone by the incantation. Then a wild thought escaped from him. He would miss him, and he might find some way out. He thought of himself running free over the grass, grieving for Merry, Sam, and Pippin, but free and alive. Gandalf would admit there had been nothing else he could do. But the courage had been awakened in him was now too strong. He could not leave his friends so easily. He wavered, groping in his pocket, and then fought with himself again. And as he did, so did the arm crept near. Suddenly, resolve hardened in him, and he seized a short sword that lay beside him, and kneeling, he stooped low over the bodies of his companions. With what strength he had hewed from the crawling arm near the wrist, the hand broke off, but at the same moment the sword splintered up to the hilt. There was a shriek, and a light vanished, and in the dark there was a snarling noise. Frodo fell forward over Merry, and Merry's face felt cold. All at once into his mind, from which it had disappeared with the first coming of the fog, came the memory of the house down under the hill, and of Tom singing. He remembered the rhyme that Tom had taught them. In a small, desperate voice he began, "Ho, Tom Bombadil." And with that the name of his voice seemed to grow strong. It had a full and lively sound, and the dark chamber echoed as if to drum and trumpet. Ho, Tom Bombadil, Tom Bombadillo, by water, wood, and hill, by reed and willow, by fire, sun, and moon, hearken now and hear us. Come, Tom Bombadil, for our need is near us. There was a sudden, deep silence, in which Frodo could hear his heart beating. After a long, slow movement, he heard plain, but far away, as if it was coming down through the ground or thick walls, an answering voice singing. Oh, Tom Bombadil is a merry fellow. Bright blue his jacket is, and his boots are yellow. None has ever got him yet, for Tom he is master. His songs are stronger songs, and his feet are faster. There was a loud rumbling sound as of stones rolling and falling, and suddenly light streamed in, real light, the plain light of day. A low door-like opening appeared at the end of the chamber beyond Frodo's feet, and there was Tom's head, hat, feather, and all, framed against the light of the sun rising behind him. The light fell upon the floor and upon the faces of the 3 hobbits lying beside Frodo. They did not stir, but the sickly hue had left them. They looked now as if they were only deeply asleep. Tom stooped, removed his hat, and came into the dark chamber singing. "Get out, you old wick. Vanish in the sunlight. Shrivel like the cold mist, like the winds go wailing. Go out into the barren lands far beyond the mountains. Come never here again. Leave your barrow empty. Lost and forgotten be, darker than the darkness, for where gates stand forever shut, to the world is mended." At these words, there was a cry, and a part of the inner end of the chamber fell in with a crash. There in the long trailing shriek, fading away into an unguessable distance, and after that, silence. "Come, friend Frodo," said Tom, "let us get out to clean grass. You must help me bear them." Together they carried out Merry, Pippin, and Sam. As Frodo left the barrow for the last time, he thought he saw a severed hand wriggling still, like a wounded spider in the heap of a fallen earth. Tom went back in and again, and there was a sound of much thumping and stamping. When he came out, he was bearing in his arms a great load of treasure. Things of gold, silver, copper, and bronze, many beads and chained and jeweled ornaments. He climbed the barrow and laid them all on top of the sunshine. There he stood, with his hat in his hands and the wind in his hair, and looked down upon the 3 hobbits that had laid on their backs upon the grass at the west side of the mound. Raising his right hand, he said in a clear and commanding voice, "Wake now, my merry lads, wake and hear me calling. Warm now be heart and limb. The stone is fallen, dark door is standing wide, dead hand is broken, night under night is flown, and the gate is open." To Frodo's great joy, the hobbits stirred, stretched their arms, rubbed their eyes, and then suddenly sprang up. They looked about in amazement, at first at Frodo, and then at Tom, standing large as life on the barrow top above them. Then at themselves, in their thin white rags, crowned and belted with pale gold, and jingling with trinkets. "What in the name of wonder," began Merry, feeling the golden circlet that had slipped over one eye. Then he stopped, and a shadow came over his face, and he closed his eyes. "Of course, I remember," he said. "The men of Carndum came on us at night, and we were worsted. Ah, the spear in my heart." He clutched at his breast. "No, no," he said, opening his eyes. "What am I saying? I've been dreaming. Where did you get to, Frodo?" "I thought I was lost," said Frodo, "but I don't want to speak of it. Let us think of what we are to do now. Let us go on." "Dressed up like this, sir," said Sam. "Where are my clothes?" He flung his circlet, belt, and rings on the grass, and looked round helplessly as if he expected to find his cloak, jacket, and breeches, and other hobbit garments lying around somewhere. "You won't find your clothes again," said Tom, bounding down from the mound and laughing as he danced round them in the sunlight. One would have thought that nothing dangerous nor dreadful had happened, and indeed the horror faded out of their hearts as they looked at him, and he saw the merry glint in his eyes. "What do you mean?" asked Pippin, looking at him, half puzzled, half assumed. "Why not?" But Tom shook his head, saying, "You've found yourselves again out of deep water. Clothes are but little loss, if you escape from drowning. Be glad, my merry friends, and let the warm sunlight heat now heart and limb. Cast off these cold rags, run naked on the grass, while Tom goes a-hunting. He sprang away downhill, whistling and calling. Looking down after him, Frodo saw him running away westward, southwards, along the green hollow between their hill and the next, still whistling and crying. Hey now, come hoy now, whither do you wander? Up, down, near or far, here, there, or yonder. Sharp ears, wise nose, swish tail and bumpkin, white socks, my little lad, and old fatty lumpkin. So he sang, running fast, tossing up his hat and catching it, until he was hidden by a fold in the ground. But for some time his hey now, hoy now, came floating back down the wind, which had shifted round towards the south. The air was growing warm again. The hobbits ran about for a while on the grass, as he told them, then lay basking in the sun with a delight for those that they have climbed, been wafted suddenly bitter winter to a friendly clime, or of people that, after long being ill and bedridden, one day wake to find that they are unexpectedly well, and the day is again full of promise. By the time Tom had returned, they were feeling strong and hungry. He reappeared hat first over the brow of the hill, and behind him came an obedient line of 6 ponies. Their own 5, and one more. The last was plainly old fatty Lumpkin. He was stronger, larger, fatter, and older than their own ponies. Mary, to whom the others belonged, had not, in fact, given them any such names, but they had answered to the new names that Tom had given them for the rest of their lives. Tom called them one by one, and they climbed down over the brow and stood in a line. Then Tom bowed to the hobbits. "Here are your ponies now," he said. "They've more sense in some ways than you wandering hobbits have, more sense in their noses, for they sniff danger ahead, which you walk right into. And if they run to save themselves, then they run the right way. You must forgive them all, for their hearts are faithful to face fear of Barrow-wights, and not that they were made for. See, they have come again, bringing all their burdens." Merry and Sam and Pippin now clothed themselves in spare garments from their packs, and they had soon felt too hot, for they were obliged to put on some of thicker and warmer things that they had brought against the oncoming winter. "Where does that other old animal, that fatty Lumpkin, come from?" asked Frodo. "He's mine," said Tom, "my 4-legged friend, though I had seldom ride him, and he wanders often far, free upon the hillsides. When your ponies stayed with me, they got to know my Lumpkin, and they smelt him in the night, and quickly ran to meet him. I thought he'd look for them, and with his words of wisdom, take away all their fear. But now, my jolly Lumpkin, old Tom's going to ride. Hey, he's coming with you, just to set you on the road, so he needs a pony. For you cannot easily talk to hobbits that are riding when you are on your own legs trying to trot beside them." The hobbits were delighted to hear this, and thanked Tom many times, but he laughed and said that they were so good at losing themselves that he would not feel happy till he had seen them safe over the borders of his land. "I've got things to do," he said. "My making and my singing, my talking and my walking, and my watching of the country. Tom can't always be near open doors and willow cracks. Tom has his house to mind, and Goldberry is waiting." It was fairly early by the sun, something between 9 and 10, and the hobbits turned their minds to food. Their last meal had been lunch besides the Standing Stone the day before. They breakfasted now, and off the remainder of Tom's provisions meant for their supper, with the dishes that Tom had brought with him. It was not a large meal, considering hobbits and the circumstances, but they felt much better for it. While they were eating, Tom went up to the mound and looked through the treasures. Most of these he made into a pile that glistened and sparkled on the grass. He bade them lie there, free to all finders, birds, beasts, elves or men, and all kindly creatures. For so the spell of the mound should have been broken and scattered, and no wight ever come back to it. He chose for himself from the pile a brooch set with blue stones, many shaded like fax flowers or the wings of blue butterflies. He looked long at it, as if stirred by some memory, shaking his head, and saying at last, "Here's a pretty toy for Tom and for his lady. Fair was she who long ago wore this on her shoulder. Goldberry shall wear it now, and we will not forget her." For each of the hobbits he chose a dagger, long, leaf-shaped and keen, of marvelous workmanship, damask with serpent forms in red and gold. They gleamed as he drew them from their black sheaths, wrought of some strange metal, light and strong, and set with many fiery stones. Whether by some virtue in these sheaths, or become of the spell that lay on the mound, the blades seemed untouched by time, unrusted, sharp, glittering in the sun. "Old knives are long enough as swords for hobbit people," he said. "Sharp blades are good to have, if shire folk go walking, east, south, or far away. Far away into dark and danger." Then he told them that these blades were forged many long years ago by men of Westerness. They were foes of the Dark Lord, but they were overcome by the evil king of Carndum in the land of Angmar. "Few now remember them," Tom murmured, "yet still some go wandering, sons of forgotten kings, walking in loneliness, guarding from the evil things that folk are heedless." The hobbits did not understand his words, but as he spoke they had a vision as if it were a great expanse of years behind them, like a vast shadowy plain over which there strode shapes of men, tall and grim with bright swords, and came one with a star on his brow. Then the vision faded, and they were back in the sunlit world. It was time to start again. They made ready, packing their bags and lading their ponies. Their new weapons they hung from their belts, under their jackets, feeling them very awkward and wondering if they would be of any use. Fighting had not before occurred to any of them as one of the adventures which their flight would land them. At last they set off. They led their ponies down the hill, and mounting they trotted quickly along the valley. They took back and saw the top of the old mound on the hill, and from the sunlight on the gold went up the hill like a yellow flame. They turned a shoulder of the downs, and it was hidden from view. Though Frodo looked about him on every side, he saw no sign of the great stones standing like a gate. And before long they fell away before him. It was a merry journey with Tom Bombadil trotting gaily besides them and before them on Fatty Lumpkin, who could move much faster than his girth promised. Tom sang songs most of the time, but was chiefly nonsense, or else perhaps a strange language unknown to the hobbits, an ancient language whose words were mainly those of wonder and delight. They went forward steadily, but as soon as they saw the road was further away than they had imagined, even without a fog, their sleep at midday would have prevented them from reaching until after nightfall on the day before. The dark line that they had seen was not a line of trees, but a line of bushes, growing on the edge of a deep dike with a steep wall on the further side. Tom said that it had once been the boundary of a kingdom, but a very long time ago. He seemed to remember something sad about it, and would not say much. They climbed down and out of the dike and through a gap in the wall, and then Tom turned due north, where they had been bearing somewhat to the west. The land was now open and fairly level, and they had quickened their pace, but the sun was already sinking, low when it was last when at last they saw a line of trees ahead, and they knew that they had come to back the road after many unexpected adventures. They galloped their ponies over the last furlongs and halted under the long shadows of trees. They were on top of the slope bank. And the road, now dim as evening drew on, and wound away below them. At this point, it ran nearly from southwest to northeast, and on their right it fell quickly down to a wide hollow. It was rutted and bore many signs of the recent heavy rain. There were pools and potholes full of water. They rode down the bank and looked up and down. There was nothing to be seen. "Well, here we are again at last," said Frodo. "Suppose we haven't lost more than 2 days by my shortcut through the forest, but perhaps the delay will prove useful. It may have been put... Oh my goodness. It may have put them off our trail." The others looked at him. The shadow of the fear of the Black Riders came suddenly over them again. Ever since they had entered the forest, they thought chiefly of getting back to the road. Only now, where it lay beneath their feet, did they remember the danger which pursued them, and was more than likely to be lying in wait for them upon the road itself. They looked anxiously back towards the setting sun. The road was brown and empty. "Do you think," asked Pippin, hesitantly, "do you think we may be pursued tonight?" "No, I hope not," answered Tom Bombadil. "Nor perhaps the next day. But I do not trust my guess, for I cannot tell for certain. Our east, my knowledge fails. Tom is not master of riders from the Black Land far beyond his country. All the same, the hobbits wished he was coming with them. They felt he would know how to deal with Black Riders, if anyone did. They would soon now be going forward into lands wholly strange to them, and beyond all but the most vague and distant legends of the Shire, and all the gathering twilights they longed for home. A deep loneliness and sense of loss was on them. They stood silent, reluctant to make the final parting. And only slowly became aware of Tom was wishing them farewell, and telling them to have good heart and to ride on till dark without halting. "Tom will give you good advice until this day is over. After that, your own luck must go with you and guide you." 4 miles along the road, you will come upon a village. Bree under Bree Hill, with doors looking westward. There you'll find an old inn that is called the Prancing Pony. Barlaman Butterbur is the worthy keeper. There you can stay the night, and afterwards, the morning will speed you on your way. Be bold but wary. Keep your merry hearts and ride to meet your fortune. They begged him to come at least as far as the inn and drink once more with them, but he laughed and refused, saying, "Tom's country ends here. He will not pass the borders. Tom has his house to mind, and Goldberry is waiting." He then turned, tossing up his hat, leapt on to Lumpkin's back, and rode up over the bank and away, singing into dusk. The hobbits climbed up, watching him until he was out of sight. "I'm sorry to take leave of Master Bombadil," said Sam. "He's a caution and no mistake. I reckon we may go a good deal further and be seen naught better nor queerer. But I won't deny I'll be glad to see his prancing pony he spoke of. And I hope it'll be like the Green Dragon way back home." "What sort of folk are in the Bree?" "There are hobbits in the Bree," said Mary, "as well as big folk. I dare say it'll be home-like enough." The pony is a good inn by all accounts. My people ride out there now and again. It may be all we could wish, said Frodo, but it is outside the Shire all the same. Don't make yourself too much at home. Please remember, all of you, that the name of Baggins must not be mentioned. I am Mr. Underhill, if any name must be given. Now they mounted their ponies and rode off silently into the evening. Darkness came down quickly as they plodded slowly downhill and up again, until at last they saw the light twinkling some distance ahead. Before them rose Bree Hill, barring the way, a dark mass against the misty stars, and under its western flank nestled a large village. Toward it they now hurried, desiring only to find a fire and a door between them and the night. And that is where we are going to leave off as we end chapter 9. Sorry, chapter 8, before chapter 9. And that is as well where we are going to end stream. I hope you all are very relaxed. I hope you all had a good time listening. I apologize for my constant yawning and my stuttering. I cannot help but feel very tired whenever I read, so I am sorry. Super comfy, thank you. Of course, thank you everyone for coming by. Thank you so much. Please end your night well. Sleep well. Take care. I will see you all tomorrow, okay? Everyone, please. Good night.